Good evening, and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. And this is the last day of 2024. I mean, I don't know about you, but where I live, in Los Angeles, New Year's Eve has become like a war zone. There are sounds of firecrackers, not even firecrackers. It sounds like bombs going off all night of illegal fireworks. I find it really hard to sleep, so I thought I would create a little episode in case you were in the same boat and you live somewhere where there are these fireworks that go off for like 3 days. Maybe this will help you. I have a longer, more in-depth narrative in the works for next week, but consider this just an offering in case it helps you. I have made this extra sleepy Dead Sleep episode that takes a very famous case, a story that is usually told as an example of mass hysteria. But for this episode, I'm looking at it from a different point of view, treating it like a legal procedural, a true crime story, a small piece of history from years and years ago that might help generate a deeper understanding. One of the most controversial yet crucial tools used in the criminal justice system. And it's one that's bandied about a lot in the United States, even in the world of true crime. And that term is plea bargain or plea deal. And it's a pretty humble sounding phrase for a profoundly important process. For followers of true crime, plea deals have defined the fate of any number of famous cases, from the Memphis 3 to Michael Peterson and the staircase. In this country, 98% of federal criminal cases are resolved through plea bargaining. And on the state level, it's an estimated 95%, which means those cases never go to trial, but they're pleaded out, a plea bargain, an arrangement between a prosecutor and the accused and their attorney. With this country's backlog of criminal cases, plea bargaining is considered essential and efficient. Spare the taxpayer and the defendant all that expense, and potentially the victims' families or survivors all that pain. And again, it seems simple. If someone's guilty and there's enough evidence to find them guilty, why not have them plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence, more leniency, or in some cases, avoid death? And tonight's episode is about one of the first, earliest examples that legal scholars use to examine plea bargaining and the consequences of what happens when it's abused. And we'll hear more about it in just a moment. And just a gentle butterfly kiss of a reminder that Dead Sleep is 100% independent and ad-free. Your paid subscription is how this show exists. It's how we survive and thrive. Thank you so much to everyone who currently supports the show. I really appreciate it. And if one of your commitments to yourself is a path to better sleep hygiene in 2025, I hope this show gives you that. And I would appreciate it if you would consider becoming a paid subscriber. I have links to all of those options in the show notes. You get a free month on Apple Podcasts and a 7-day free trial on Patreon. And as I've said, as soon as Spotify lets me do that, I am going to offer that on Spotify. Try before you buy. Why not? I'm all for it. And as always, this is the True Crime for Bedtime version of True Events. If you want to know more about this topic, I've shared links in the show notes. So with that, let's settle in for the night. Get cozy under those covers. Close your eyes and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime in a very tiring dead sleepy history of the origins of the plea bargain. This particular story begins on a cold and dark and stark and bleak February night in Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. When Samuel Parris, a 39-year-old husband and father originally from London, noticed his daughter Betty behaving strangely. Just yesterday, she was a good little girl, just 9 years old, innocent and sweet. And then overnight, she changed, a shadowy silhouette in candlelight. He could hear her making sounds. What was that? Panting, growling. Those weren't the sounds of an innocent little girl, but the utterances of a sinister spirit, one that would soon spread like a disease. Samuel noticed his little daughter Betty and her orphan cousin, who lived with the family, started crawling on their hands and knees, their bodies contorting into unholy shapes, their necks craned forward. The girls, one at a time, and then together, opened their mouths and screamed, howled. Then they barked and barked and barked. And then they rolled around in a violent animal display. Then his daughter and her cousin and their friends, all suddenly, strangely, behaving like a pack of wild dogs. And then, as if some magic spell was broken, and then another dark spell cast, his daughter Betty and the other girls went silent, still. Betty staring off into the distance as if her mind and soul were somewhere else, under the influence of something else, someone else. What unseen force captivated the girls' attention? What were they looking at? Who were they listening to? Were the angels calling to them from heaven? Or demons beckoning from the depths of hell? Samuel Parris was a minister in Salem, a Puritan who was always watchful for the spirit of the devil. And it made him a busy man, because the devil was always at work, especially adept at inhabiting the young bodies of innocent souls. Reverend Samuel was horrified and worried with what was wrong with his daughter. Was there anything wrong? Children imitate animals, including growls and barks, as part of their development, and in some instances, use animal sounds as a means to communicate when they feel shy or fearful, or they don't yet have the words to say what they need. A child could bark for food, whimper for friendly attention, or growl as a way to draw a personal boundary, a warning to stay away. Reverend Samuel, he saw something else. Not something human, natural, but something foreign, dangerous. So the minister interrogated his daughter Betty and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail. And it didn't take long for the two little girls to snitch. What was happening to them was the work of a witch Who was this witch? The father wanted to know. And the girls said it was Tituba who cast this dark spell on them. Tituba. Reverend Samuel knew Tituba. Before she became the prime suspect, she was Betty's caretaker. She essentially raised her and Betty's other siblings since they were born. Tituba was an easy target. She was already a captive in Reverend Samuel's house. Tituba was originally from South America, believed to be native Venezuelan, a member of the indigenous Arawak tribe, who was herself kidnapped as a child, enslaved, and shipped to Barbados, where, as a teenager, she was sold to Samuel to work on his father's sugarcane plantation. When Samuel, then a bachelor merchant, decided he wanted to pursue a higher calling as a Puritan minister and moved to New England, he brought Tituba with him. Samuel knew Tituba, perhaps even intimately, for 12 years. He also knew her husband, a man they called John Indian. But no matter, Tituba, Reverend Samuel was convinced, was a witch. Did Reverend Samuel actually believe Tituba, someone he'd known since she was practically a child, was a spell-conjuring witch? Maybe, maybe not. But she was the perfect scapegoat. Reverend Samuel was in a bit of a bind. When he took the job as Salem's Puritan minister, he didn't know how tough it was going to be. He was overworked and underpaid, and, he thought, unappreciated by the Puritan community. In the last several years, that church was a revolving door. Samuel was the fourth minister in a relatively short span of time. After a few years on the job, his own livelihood was on the line. These were hard times, financially and personally, and he couldn't just afford to get fired as a minister, not with a wife and family to support. If he failed to inspire his congregation through faith, he'd unify them through fear. In that winter of 1692, Minister Samuel's most powerful message to the dour residents of Salem Village was one of vigilance. Witches and wizards, devils, demons, you see, they were everywhere. And it was up to every one of us in this congregation to root them out. Tituba was backed into a corner in what was basically an early form of a plea agreement. Confess and tell us who else was involved, who are the other witches, and we'll cut you a break. We'll let you live. So she confessed, and Tituba, she named a few names. 2 women she didn't actually know, and her so-called admission of guilt as the so-called Black Witch of Salem had a lot of the hallmarks that we would come to recognize much later as forced or coerced confession in exchange for leniency. Tituba's testimony was drawn from something called spectral evidence, legally allowed testimony based on a witness's visions or dreams. The notion was that people were more vulnerable in their sleep. Back then, it was as if there were a window left unlocked and slightly open. Your unguarded soul beckoning evil spirits, drawing them in like the scent of a delicious freshly baked apple pie with cinnamon. left to cool on the kitchen window in those old cartoons. Evil spirits got a whiff of that pure aroma of fresh soul, and they couldn't help themselves. They'd find their way in. In transcripts, Tituba's testimony included dark and haunting visions of the devil, along with the other 2 women she named, the women in the town, who she said forced her to do harm to the young girls, including casting a spell over them that made them act like animals and put them into a trance. One pivotal and persuasive detail in her testimony was a vision where she said she saw herself writing her own name in a book, a devil's book. And she signed her own name in blood. And in that book, there were 9 other names, 9 other signatures, which meant there were at least 9 more witches somewhere out there in Salem. Tituba's testimony would essentially become the defining narrative, the public record, and her version of events would become known all over the village, shared and reshared. And as information spread, so did the accusations. All kinds of people were accused of being witches. And the deal was, if you confessed, you were spared. Once you admitted you were a witch, you were no longer considered a threat. Those witches who confessed were also required to offer up other names, and, like a jailhouse informant, they had to narc on other secret witches who were hiding amongst them. Basically, once you confessed and offered up another name or 2, you were safe. And that's when Reverend Samuel discovered his true calling as Salem's de facto district attorney and chief prosecutor. And thus began the Salem witch trials, a 16-month mass psychogenic phenomenon that would be the town's twisted legacy. For all of my life, I thought of the Salem witch trials as an example of what we would once call mass hysteria and the treacherous hazards of groupthink, like those cheerleaders in Leroy, New York, in that podcast Hysteria. But looking at it now, from the lens of true crime, it seems less like some mass psychosis and more strategic. Because if you suffered from the spells, if it appears you were a victim of the witchcraft, you were likely to be safe. Tituba's own husband, John Indian, at one point appeared to be under the spell of that witchcraft. He likely did it to stay alive. It was like some viral criminal Ponzi scheme led by Reverend Samuel. He basically collected the hollow confessions of a few people, then exonerated them so that he could collect more confessions, which would lead to more possible suspects, more witches, which would help him gain more authority, more power, and help him keep his job. And again, maybe it's just my true crime brain seeing it that way. But at the very least, it affords those involved back then a bit more intellectual credit, that they're not necessarily as different from us, or we from them. So this wasn't some Puritan brainwashing. It was much savvier, more Orwellian. Doublethink, what was going on, was a farce. And they did what they could to survive, because the alternative was really grim. These trials led to roughly 150 arrests, including women, married couples, even a 4-year-old child whose wrists and ankles were too small for prison shackles. And yet, nonetheless, she was held in a dungeon for nearly a year. By October of 1692, when this whole thing reached its peak pitch, just over 6 months after the initial incident with Samuel's daughter, and her strange behavior. 20 people, 15 women and 4 men, had been executed. 19 died by hanging. And that final person, the 20th execution, that happened in September of that year. His name was Giles Corey, and he was a local farmer who refused to say a word. A confession, an admission of guilt, would mean he could lose his land. A denial would mean he could lose his life. In court records, Giles Corey is described as staying mute, which was perceived as defiant. To coax a confession, or to get him to say definitively one way or another, the local sheriff used a form of coercive torture called peine forte de douleur. Translated from French, it means strong and hard punishment. And it was. This farmer, Giles, he was 81 years old, and yet he was forced to lie down on the ground, face and chest up, while a large wood board was placed on top of him. Then, the local sheriff added weight, heavy rocks and stones, and over time, all of that weight would press down on that man's body. The desired outcome was that he'd eventually crack, either mentally or physically, and Giles would either confess or deny that he was indeed a wizard who practiced black magic. But Giles, he was tough. For 2 days, he lay there, slowly being crushed as they added rocks and stones. He never cried out until the very, very end. And as his body fatally succumbed to all that pressure, he only had 2 last words: more weight. According to American historians, Corey Giles's death was the only time that that kind of torture, that strong and hard punishment, was used in the U.S. And documents suggest Corey Giles was dragged into all of this because he was connected to the violent beating death of a man in the village years earlier, one that he'd supposedly gotten away with, and that these Salem witch trials were a way to punish him for that earlier crime. A deadly tit for tat. And for years, I think I had the Salem witch trials kind of wrong, or I assumed it was happening all over the place. Even back then, in the 1690s, when outside lawmakers intervened, what went down in Salem was seen as a deranged and deadly miscarriage of the most rudimentary understanding of justice. And much of what went wrong, from false testimony to the reliance on hearsay evidence, would later inform the legal framework found in the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It would take 100 years, the late 1700s, for the Sixth Amendment to be added to the Bill of Rights. The Sixth Amendment includes the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. It would take another 100 years, that's now 1895, for the phrase innocent until proven guilty to enter America's legal lexicon. More recently, since the use of the plea bargain has become more common in the United States, because for years, decades, it wasn't, legal scholars have pointed to Reverend Samuel's prosecutorial power during the Salem witch trials as one of the problems of the plea bargain as we know it today. That deals are struck behind closed doors, that there's no public record of what happened and what was said, at least not for the press to cover, that often victims' families and survivors aren't consulted when the deal is made, and ultimately, the biggest risk is that someone who's innocent takes a plea deal because they don't think they have an option. That it's either confess or else. On top of that, there's the fear that once the guilty plea is entered and that bargain is struck, that deal is sometimes rescinded. And that's what happened with Tituba. That she confessed, that she gave her testimony, that she pointed the finger at other witches, and she did what she was told. And yet, she remained in jail for over a year. When it was exposed that Reverend Samuel had coerced so many of these confessions, he got into big trouble. He decided just to leave her in jail. And she did manage to get out of jail eventually, but she wasn't free. Still the legal property of Reverend Samuel, who refused to pay money for her release because she'd recanted on that confession. Her way out was when she was eventually purchased by another Puritan family in another area of Massachusetts. And what happened to her and her husband John Indian after that, many historians have tried and failed to find out. As for now, it remains a mystery. And all these centuries later, something similar could be said for the plea bargain and how it's applied and negotiated. And there is some interesting new research and some solutions offered by the American Bar Association that I found pretty compelling. Stuff I hadn't really thought about before. And I'm going to link to some of those things in the show notes. There are other countries, like New Zealand, who have found ways to make the whole plea bargaining process more transparent and equitable for everyone. And how that matters to us, those of us who follow true crime, we know that transparency is how we get good reporting. And as I've said over and over again, good reporting is how we get good, ethical, excellent true crime storytelling. The kind of storytelling I aspire to bring to this show every week, and much more of it in 2025. So once again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for an incredible 2024. And I look forward to more stories and more sleep next year, including the January bonus episode, which will be out next week. Be sure to follow and subscribe to the show so you don't miss it. Until then, Happy New Year and nighty-night.